everybody, welcome to Sir Chua's Accounting Lessons PH, and this is Lesson 5, Interim Financial Reporting and Reporting by Operating Segments. At the end of the video, you should be able to explain the nature of interim financial reporting, explain the basic principles of interim financial reporting, prepare interim financial reports, describe the core principles of segment reporting, and identify reportable segments using asset test, revenue test, and operating result test. This is your lecturer, Kevin Troy M. Chua. Before anything else, please like, share, and subscribe to Sir Chua's Accounting Lessons PH and hit the notification bell button to alert you of our latest video lessons. Please comment down your questions, suggestions, and reactions. And as always, thank you very much for trusting Sir Chua's Accounting Lessons PH as your online learning partner. Our featured subscriber for this lesson is Ms. Christine Joyce Basco from the Polytechnic University of the Philippines. Hi Christine, thank you for your support for Sir Chua's Accounting Lessons PH. And this is my first time to feature a friend of mine, Sir Martin Soliman. So maybe some of you knows him, maybe some of you have been handled by him sa inyong mathematics or statistics classes. So we are good friends and we are friends and office mates in our work. So, nagtatry daw siyang mag-aral din daw ng accounting dahil na-inspire daw siya mag-aral ng accounting because of my video lessons daw. So, Sir Martin Soliman, thank you very much for your support as well for Sir Chua's Accounting Lessons PH. Okay, so we're ready to start. Our previous lesson was about the statement of cash flows and the notes to financial statements. We have already completed all 4 financial statements, including syempre yung notes to financial statements, and now we will be preparing interim financial reports and how to report operating segments. So this is still part syempre ng ating constructive accounting class, how to prepare financial statements on those perspectives. And let's start. Let's first discuss about IAS 34, Interim Financial Reporting. According to paragraph 4 of the standard, an interim period is a financial reporting period shorter than a full financial year. So, kung ang tinitignan lang din po natin ay yung mismong calendar year, if you will be preparing financial reports which is lesser than 1 year, ang tawag po doon is interim period. Now, yung reports po na i-prepare mo for that interim period, ang tawag po doon is interim financial report. Okay? Interim financial report refers to financial reports containing either a complete set of financial statements as described in IAS 1, di ba sinabi naman po sa IAS 1 kung ano yung complete set ng financial statements, or a set of condensed financial statements na i-describe natin mamaya base sa sinabi sa IAS 34. But in summary, pag sinabi po nating interim financial report, these are financial reports that are prepared to present what happened in the interim period. Okay, ganun po siya. Now, according to paragraph 8, this is the minimum components, or these are the minimum components of an interim financial report. At a minimum, it should include the following: a condensed statement of financial position, a condensed statement or condensed statements of profit or loss and other comprehensive income. So the same rule applies, yung mga 1 statement, 2 statement format natin dyan. And then condensed statement of changes in equity, condensed statement of cash flows, and syempre, selected explanatory notes to make your condensed FSS in the interim financial report more understandable. Now, as to form and content, ang sinasabi sa atin ng standard is if the entity publishes a complete set of financial statements in its interim financial report, kung paano po ang form and content na sinusunod natin sa IAS 1, yun lang din daw po ang ia-apply natin in preparing a complete set of interim financial reports. So, kung paano po siya sa IAS 1, that is how you will also be presenting it. Now, according to paragraph 10, it goes like this. If an entity publishes a set of condensed financial statements in its interim financial report, those condensed statements shall include at a minimum lahat daw po ng headings and subtotals na kasama dun sa most recent annual financial statements and the selected explanatory notes as required by the standard IAS 34. Ibig sabihin po, comparatively, kung ano po yung mga headings and subtotals from the most recent annual financial statements, that is how you will also present your interim financial statements. However, we are allowed to do the following. Additional line items or notes shall be included kasi kung yun ay tatanggalin mo, baka po siya ay maging misleading or hindi maging understandable. So, if it would need additional line items or notes, ilagay mo kung sa tingin mo, pag tinanggal mo yon baka maging misleading or not understandable yung interim financial reports mo. Okay? Now, an entity shall include in its interim financial report an explanation of events and transactions that are significant to an understanding of the changes in financial position and performance of the entity since the end of the last annual reporting period. Ang nangyayari kasi dyan, di ba, shorter than 1 year, pero ang point of reference natin galing last year, which is a full annual financial statement. So, dapat maintindihan din natin yung naging galaw, no? Coming from that specific period going to the period to date, which is your interim financial statements. Information disclosed in relation to those events and transactions shall update the relevant information presented in the most recent annual financial report. Dahil nga po ang point of reference po natin is your annual financial report, the function or the purpose of your interim financial report is parang maging update siya, 'di ba? Sana all naga-update. Para maging update siya ng mga nangyari or relevant information coming from the most recent annual financial report. Kaya kagagawa ng interim report para maggawa ng updates. Parang ganon. Okay? The following is a list of events and transactions for which disclosures would be required if they are significant, but the list is not exhaustive, but this is the list that was given to us by IAS 34. Number 1, the write-down of inventories to NRV and the reversal of such write-down. The recognition of a loss from the impairment of financial assets, PPE, intangibles, assets arising from contracts with customers or other assets, and kung meron pong reversal ng impairment loss yung mga assets na yun. And then, reversal of any provisions for the cost of restructuring, acquisitions and disposals of items of PPE, commitments for the purchase of PPE, settlements of litigations, corrections of prior period errors, changes in the business or economic circumstances that affect the fair value of the entity's financial assets and financial liabilities, whether those assets or liabilities are recognized at fair value or amortized cost. And then, any loan default or breach of a loan agreement that has been remedied on or before the end of the reporting period. Also, your RPTs or related party transactions, and then transfers between levels of the fair value hierarchy used in measuring the fair value of the financial statements. Changes in the classification of financial assets as a result of a change in the purpose or use of those assets, and changes in contingent liabilities or contingent assets. Those are the disclosures that are required if they are significant, but other disclosures are acceptable because the list is not exhaustive, and that's acceptable if it would add understandability in your interim financial reports. Other disclosures will include the following: a statement that the same accounting policies and methods of computation are followed in the interim financial statements as compared with the most recent annual financial statements, or if those policies or method have been changed, a description of the nature and effect of the change. That's very important because ang gusto natin kasing mapakita dyan na is kung ano naman yung in-apply mong accounting policies and methods of computation with your annual financial statements as your comparative point of reference, dapat yung interim FS mo, ganun din. However, if there are changes to those policies, methods, or calculations, you should explain why. Okay? Explanatory comments about the seasonality or cyclicality of interim operations, and in the first place, why are we doing this? Parang ganon. And then the nature and amount of items affecting assets, liabilities, equity, net income, or cash flows that are unusual because of their nature, signs, or incidents. The nature and amount of changes in estimates of amounts reported in prior interim periods of the current financial year or changes in estimates of amounts reported in prior financial years. Also, this would also include your issues, repurchases, and repayments of debt and equity securities, dividends paid separately for ordinary shares and other segment information. It will also include events after the interim period that had not been reflected in the financial statements for the interim period. So parang kung meron tayong events after the reporting period, dapat din daw po mag-disclose din tayo ng events after the interim period na hindi na-reflect dun sa mismong interim period na yun. And then, in any cases na nag-change yung ating mga investments or yung ating pong other ownerships, no? The effect of changes in the composition of the entity during the interim period, business combinations, obtaining control, losing control of subsidiaries, any other long-term investments, restructuring, and discontinued operations. Okay? In the cases of business combinations, the entity shall disclose the information na hinihingi sa atin ng standard na IFRS 3 business combinations. For financial instruments, the disclosures about fair value required by IFRS 13, fair value measurement, and IFRS 7, financial instruments disclosures. For entities becoming or ceasing to be investment entities as defined in IFRS 10 consolidated financial statements, the disclosures in IFRS 12, disclosures of interest in other entities, paragraph 9b, you will also have to follow that. And the disaggregation of revenue from contracts with customers as required by IFRS 15, revenue from contracts with customers. Actually, this is just an exhaustive list of the disclosures na nire-require sa atin ng standard ng IAS 34. Pero kung di naman nangyari yan, edi wala ka naman dapat ilagay. It's just that kung mangyayari yan during the interim period, you have to disclose that. Okay? Yun lang naman po yung sinasabi ng standard doon. Kaya natin binasa isa-isa. Okay? So, periods for which interim financial statements are required to be presented. So, paano po ba dapat ang presentation? Statement of financial position as of the end of the current interim period at ang magiging point of comparison mo is the SFP or the balance sheet at the end of the immediately preceding financial year. For your income statement, statements of profit or loss and other comprehensive income for the current interim period and cumulatively for the current financial year to date. Kasi syempre, hindi ka pwedeng mag-present ng quarter 1 lang, tas quarter 2 lang. So, ang sinabi ng standard, meron kang cumulative presentation din. Okay? And then, syempre, meron ka dapat comparative statements of profit or loss and other comprehensive income for the comparable interim periods of the immediately preceding financial year. Because as you know, nga, kakabanggit lang natin, that is your point of comparison. As permitted by IAS 1, an interim report may present each period a statement or statements of profit or loss and other comprehensive income. Ibig sabihin, ganun din, parang sa IAS 1, pwedeng magkasama, pwedeng magkahiwalay. Pero, ang lagi nyong tatandaan is yung word na cumulatively ang pagpe-present natin ng statements of profit or loss or other comprehensive income, lalo na kung quarterly, parang ganon, no, in our interim financial reports. Statement of changes in equity, cumulatively din for the current financial year to date. So, ibig sabihin, cumulative hanggang sa date ng iyong presentation ng interim reports, cumulative amount. And then, ang point of comparison mo, syempre, is yung immediately preceding financial year. And the same goes with your statement of cash flows. Siyempre, kailangan din po nating i-apply yung concept ng materiality. In deciding how to recognize, measure, classify, or disclose an item for interim financial reporting purposes, materiality shall be assessed in relation to the interim period financial data. So, kung paano po natin i-apply yung materiality nung nag-uusap pa lang po tayo ng full year FS, ganun din po natin i-apply yung materiality. In making assessments of materiality, it should be recognized that interim measurements may rely on estimates to a greater extent than measurements of annual financial data. Okay? So, take note nyo po yan ha. Pag nag-a-assess daw po tayo ng materiality, ano daw pong sinabi? Interim measurements may rely on estimates to a greater extent than measurements of annual financial data. dahil po hindi siya one full year FS, yung ating pong pag-a-assess ng materiality will be based on a greater extent of an estimation rather than kung paano tayo mag-estimate for the preparation of annual FS. Okay? So, mas mataas po yung level ng estimation na ginagamit natin or in measuring or in determining materiality rather. No, in determining materiality pag interim financial report. Totoo naman kasi kapag ka annual year FS, madaling kunin lahat ng total sales, total cost at the end of the period eh. Pero kapag ka po kasi interim financial reporting, you are relying more on percentages, you are relying on trends, you are relying on some more gross profit rates, mga ganon. So, anong nangyayari kasi is mas magre-rely tayo sa estimate dahil hindi naman full year FS yung ginagawa natin. Okay? An entity shall apply the same accounting policies in its interim financial statements as are applied in its annual FS, except for accounting policy changes made after the date of the most recent annual financial statements that are to be reflected in the next annual financial statements. The frequency of an entity's reporting shall not affect the measurement of its annual results. Tandaan nyo yun the frequency of an entity's reporting shall not affect the measurement of its annual results. To achieve that objective, measurements from interim reporting purposes shall be made on a year-to-date basis. Okay? In summary, kung paano tayo gumawa at kung paano tayo mag-apply ng accounting policies and measurements and calculations for the full year FS, it's the same way that how you will be applying it in the interim financial statements. Okay? Revenues that are received seasonally, cyclically, or occasionally within a financial year shall not be anticipated or deferred as of an interim date if anticipation or deferral would not be appropriate at the end of the entity's financial year. So basically, nakadepende po kasi sa ating revenue recognition, depende kung yung revenues mo ay seasonally, cyclically, or occasional lang nangyayari. So, wag daw po tayong gagamit ng anticipated revenue or magdi-defer tayo ng revenue kung yung ganong kaparaanan na ginagawa natin for interim financial report will not be appropriate if you will be preparing a full year FS. Okay? Examples include dividend revenue, royalties, and government grants. Additionally, some entities consistently earn more revenues in certain interim periods for a financial year than in other interim periods. For example, seasonal revenues of retailers, such revenues are recognized when they occur. So, kasi usually, parang ang general rule kasi, no? If an expense, for example, is being incurred throughout the year at pinag-prepare ka ng quarterly interim financial report, you just have to divide it by 4 to get the amount of the quarter. But for example, ganito yung nangyayari sa atin, medyo seasonal lang, no? Okay, meron tayong seasonal revenue na talaga sobrang taas ang revenue mo pag Christmas season. Tapos pinag-prepare ka ng financial statements for Q4 na quarter 4. Siyempre, quarter 4 ang December, di ba? Anong sabi ng standard sa atin? Such revenues are recognized when they occur and it will not be spread out during the whole financial year. Kasi nga po, it's very important for you to report that in that specific season kasi dun mismo nangyari yung seasonal revenue mo. So those revenues will be recognized when they really happen. Okay? Costs that are incurred unevenly during an entity's financial year shall be anticipated or deferred for interim reporting purposes if and only if it is also appropriate to anticipate or defer that type of cost at the end of the financial year. Pag meron po kasi tayong mga costs and expenses na incurred unevenly, ang basic rule dyan is kung kailan nangyari, doon mo lang talaga siya ilalagay. Okay? Ganun lang. Kasi unevenly hindi naman siya spread out during the whole year. So, the best way to do that is, kung kailan nangyari, pag prepare mo na ng interim financial report, pasok mo na dun. Wala ka ng allocation na gagawin. The measurement procedures to be followed in an interim financial report shall be designed to ensure that the resulting information is reliable and that all material financial information that is relevant to an understanding of the financial position or performance of the entity is appropriately disclosed. Ang gusto naman po nating ma-achieve no, sa ating pagpe-prepare ng interim financial report is still the purpose of why you are presenting it, and syempre dapat mas maiintindihan talaga, no? While measurements in both annual and interim financial reports are often based on reasonable estimates, the preparation of interim financial reports will generally require a greater use of estimation methods than annual financial reports, like what I've mentioned to you earlier. In any cases that there is a restatement of previously reported interim periods, ganito daw po gagawin natin. A change in accounting policy other than one for which the transition is specified by a new IFRS, ganito daw nyo po siya i-reflect. I-restate mo rin po ang financial statements of prior interim periods of the current financial year and the comparative interim periods of any prior financial years that will be restated in the annual FS in accordance with IAS 8. Damay lahat kasi retrospective application dahil change in accounting policy. Pero binibigyan tayo ng medyo leeway ng standard kung sakaling impracticable gawin yon. When it is impracticable to determine the cumulative effect at the beginning of the financial year of applying a new accounting policy to all prior periods, adjusting the financial statements of prior interim periods of the current financial year, and comparable interim periods of prior financial years to apply the new accounting policy prospectively na lang hanggang sa earliest date na kaya mo siyang apply, no? Pero parang medyo delikadong sabihin natin yan. Kasi general rule under IAS 8, lalo na po kapag ka full year FS yung ginagawa natin, any change in accounting policy is applied retrospectively. 'Di ba? Kaya po, I suggest, mas maganda po talagang gawin natin is bullet point number 1. Ang bullet point number 2 po kasi is only given to us in any case that applying the change in accounting policy retrospectively in the interim financial reports is impracticable, no? Pero mas maganda po mag-stick talaga tayo sa bullet point number 1. And that is our theoretical discussions for IAS 34 Interim Financial Report. Let's move on to IFRS 8 Operating Segments. Later on, magkakaroon tayo ng sample problems to apply yung ating mga theories na na-discuss. Operating Segments. Additional information about the operations of an entity is provided through the reporting of enterprise components. Operating segments are actually enterprise components. Its purpose is to inform users of the financial reports of the different types of products and services that the company provides or the different geographical areas in which it operates to help understand the entity better. Reporting by operating segments is required for companies where their equity or debt securities are publicly traded. They are also required for companies which are in the process of issuing equity and debt securities in public securities market. Operating segments are actually additional information that would give us more understandability about the types of products and services of the company based on these segments or the different geographical areas in which they operate. However, the question here is, are really these segments reportable? Or pag sinabi nating reportable, karapat dapat ba siyang i-report separately? Parang ganon, no? Will it really include or will it really add to the understandability of the financial statements if it will be reported separately? So, pag-usapan natin yan. Okay? An operating segment is a component of an entity that engages in business activities from which it may earn revenues and incur expenses, whose operating results are reviewed by the entity's chief operating decision maker for the purpose of assessing the component's performance and allocating enterprise resources, and for which discrete financial information is available. Parang medyo malabo pa. So, next slide tayo. Okay? The approach of looking into an entity's organizational and management structure in its financial reporting system to identify the segments na pwede mong i-report for external reporting is called the management approach. Talking deeper about management approach, an operating segment is one whose performance is being monitored by a manager who is directly accountable to a chief operating decision maker. It stands alone as an operating segment because ang performance niya, revenue, expenses, operations, minomonitor ng isang head or ng isang manager. Not necessarily one segment, one manager, pero meron talagang manager na nag-check ng operations niya. And directly accountable yung manager na yun sa chief operating decision maker. Now, according to the standard, the phrase chief operating decision maker is not literally a position na kailangan nating hanapin sa entity, but it pertains to the function of the chief operating decision maker, like the CEO, parang ganon. Some components of an entity may be grouped together to form one operating segment if they have similar economic characteristics. So, kung yung separate segments naman daw po ay pare-pareho lang naman halos ng characteristics, you can actually group them together. Okay? So, yun po. Ngayon, kailan daw po i-allow yung sinasabi nating segment aggregation or pagsasama-samahin natin sila? Kung sila po ay may similarity in the nature of products and services or in the nature of the production process, the type or class of customers for the products or services, the methods used to distribute the products or provide the services, and if applicable, the nature of the regulatory environment. Ngayon po, ang sinasabi natin, we need to report these operating segments so that it would enter the understandability, di ba? We would understand the entity better. But which segments are reportable? A segment is said to be reportable when an operating segment information is required to be disclosed. Ngayon, paano natin malalaman kung required to be disclosed yung mga operating segment na yan? Gagamit tayo ngayon ng ating mga quantitative threshold. A segment is deemed reportable kung kahit isa man lang dito sa tatlong to ay nasagot niya. The revenue of the segment of the sales to external customers and transactions with other segments is 10% or more of the total revenue, internal and external, of all segments. Pag tinotal mo daw po lahat ng internal and external revenue, tas kukunin mo yung 10% nun, check mo kung pasok yung amount ng sales or revenue ng segment na yon dun sa kinuha nating 10%. Ang tawag po dun ay revenue test. Okay? Bullet point number 2. The results of the segment, whether profit or loss, is 10% or more of the combined results of all segment in profit or the combined result of all segments in loss, whichever is greater in absolute amount. So, wala tayong titignan dito na positive or negative. Kung ano daw po yung mas malaki na total in profit versus total in loss, yun yung kukuhanan natin ng 10%, tapos dapat po yung profit or loss ng segment na yon is makapasok within that 10% ng kukunin natin. Ang tawag po dyan ay operating result test or profit test. Okay? Or pwede rin naman pong the assets of the segment are 10% or more of the total assets of all segments. So, kukunin mo lahat ng total assets ng segments, kunin mo yung 10%. Pag yung asset ng isang segment is nakapasok within that 10%, reportable din po yung segment na yon. Pero ang sinasabi natin sa atin ng standard, a segment is reportable if it meets any of the following threshold. Ibig sabihin po, kahit isa lang dyan, it can be deemed reportable. Pero meron po tayong pangalawang kailangang i-check. An entity may combine segments not meeting any of the 10% threshold provided these segments have similar characteristics. So, kung gusto mo siyang makapasok dun sa 10%, pwede mo siyang i-combine provided similar characteristics siya na pasok dun sa mga in-explain natin kanina. If the management concludes that a reportable segment in the immediately preceding period is of continuing significance, the segment is still considered to be reportable in the current period kahit hindi na po siya nakapasok dun sa 10% na threshold. Parang ano yan kung dati ay reportable segment siya, tapos ngayon hindi na dahil hindi na siya nakapasok doon sa mga 10% threshold. If the management concludes that that reportable segment in the immediately preceding period is of continuing significance, it is still deemed reportable. The aggregate external revenues of the identified reportable segments after testing shall be at least 75% of the total revenues, total external revenues of the enterprise. So let's say for example, nakakita ka ng tatlong reportable segment, no? Dapat daw po yung total external revenue nung tatlong nahanap mo na operating segment, dapat mag 75% siya ng lahat ng external revenues ng lahat ng segment. Okay? Otherwise, you would add more para makapasok dun sa 75%. And when you add more, yung in-add mo, kahit hindi na siya nakapasok dun sa 10% rule natin, it will also now be deemed as reportable. Maiintindihan nyo yung sinasabi kong theory when we apply it quantitatively mamaya pag may problem tayo. If an operating segment is identified as reportable in the current period in accordance with all of the testing that we did, segment information for the preceding period shall also be disclosed even if in that period hindi siya reportable. So let's say for example, itong segment na to ngayong period reportable. Syempre, 'di ba, comparative information tayo. So segment information for the preceding period shall also be disclosed even if that time hindi siya reportable. Kasi ang nangyari, itong segment na to reportable na ngayon, last year hindi, pero dahil reportable na siya ngayon, pati yung last year relevant information ilalabas mo na, i-disclose mo na kasi reportable na siya ngayon. And also to achieve comparability, 'di ba? This shall not be done when the necessary information is not available. So, pinapayagan naman po ng standard na kung hindi available readily yung information na yon, or if the cost to develop and extract the information would really be excessive and impracticable nang mangyari, edi wag na kung sakaling ganun yung scenario. And let's now discuss some problems. So we have 4 problems about interim financial reporting, and then I will be teaching you the 10% revenue, profit, and asset test and the 75% testing para po sa ating checking of reportable segments. And let's have problem number 1. During the first quarter of 2021, Trixie Company paid $80,000 for a fire insurance premium for the whole year. Also, the entity suffered a loss of typhoon of $420,000, and upon applying lower of cost and NRV, there is a loss on inventory write-down which is $200,000. Nangyari daw po lahat yan ng first quarter ng 2021. The question is, how much would be reported as total losses and expenses in the first quarter? Ganito po gagawin natin. Yung insurance expense po natin na 80,000, yan po ay pang buong taon. Sinabi naman po sa problem that the 80,000 is a fire insurance premium for the whole year. So the 80,000 is applicable for all 4 quarters. For the first quarter, what is only applicable is 20,000. However, both your loss from typhoon and loss on inventory write-down will be reported buo during the first quarter, and this is the reason why. Costs and expenses that benefit more than one interim period will be allocated, but gains and losses are not allocated over interim periods. So ito po ang lagi niyong tatandaan. Any gains and losses, kung kailang quarter nangyari, dun mo lang ire-report sa interim financial report na yon. Hindi mo po siya i-allocate on any month. Hindi mo rin po siya i-allocate ng divided by 4, 3/12. Wala tayong ganon. When there are gains and losses, they are not allocated over the interim periods, and what you do is, kung kailang period siya nangyari, dun mo lang siya i-report. Okay? Kaya po yung buong loss from typhoon tsaka loss on inventory write-down, talagang quarter 1 losses siya sa interim financial reports natin. And lastly, always remember that LCNRV ruling in inventory is applied kahit po sa interim financial reporting. We follow still IAS 2 for that. Okay? So yan po ang ating total losses and expenses for problem 1, 640,000 pesos. And let's proceed with problem number 2. Freight companies' incurrence of cost of operations are deemed uneven. Okay, nabanggit natin yan kanina sa discussion. Paano po kaya kapag yung cost and expenses natin are uneven? Okay, i-apply natin dito sa problem. As such, some costs and expenses relate only to a certain time period. On February 1, the entity incurred 800,000 cost on advertising and promotions. Also, the entity pays bonuses to their staff at year-end. For the whole year, it is expected that bonuses will be paid in total of 2,500,000. 30% would relate to the period for the first quarter. In the interim financial reports for the first quarter, magkano ang i-report mong advertising and promotion expense and magkano ang bonuses mo. Ganito lang po yan. Sinabi po natin kanina sa theory, kapag ka po uneven ang incurrence ng cost of operations and other expenses, kung kailan siya nangyari, doon mo lang siya ilalagay. Kung kailan siya relevant, doon mo siya lalagay. So, the 800,000 cost of advertising na related on a February 1 transaction, yun na po yun. Diretso for quarter 1, 800,000. You don't have to divide it by 4 just to get it quarterly. You won't allocate that because the cost of operations are deemed uneven. Now, for bonuses, 30% daw po yung attributable for Q1. So, you just have to multiply the 2,500,000 to 30% and you get 750,000. Okay? So, kapag ka po the cost of operations are uneven, what you need to do is specifically relate it to the quarter when it happened. Let's go to problem number 3. Nicole Company will be preparing its interim financial statements for the first quarter of 2021. It was determined the total expenses for the first quarter is 3 million, wherein 30% of the expenses are variable selling and administrative expenses. Fixed selling and administrative expenses include 400,000 advertising expense to be incurred evenly during the period, and depreciation expense for the year amounting to 1,040,000. What is the proper amount to be reported as total expense for the quarter ended quarter 1, March 31? For these kinds of problems, what you need to do is step 1, split the variable and fixed portion of the expenses. So if your expenses is 3 million and 30% is for variable selling and administrative expenses, that's 3 million times 30% or 900,000. However, for the fixed selling and administrative expenses, you just have to multiply 3 million by 70%, which is the complement of 30%. Okay? So that's 2,100,000. Now, step 2, remove the advertising and depreciation amount in the fixed expenses. Why do we have to do that? Because we need to allocate properly the advertising and depreciation expenses. So, what you need to do is fixed expenses of 2,100,000 and you deduct the advertising and depreciation expense ng buo. The other fixed expenses relative for quarter 1 is 660,000. And then, you rightfully allocate the expenses for the first quarter. Your advertising of 400,000, sinabi naman po sa problem, to be incurred evenly during the period. So, 400,000 will relate to all 4 quarters of the year. You just have to divide it by 4 to get the quarter 1 advertising expense of 100,000. And for depreciation, you just have to multiply it by 3 over 12, which is January, February, and March depreciation, 260,000. Now that we have all of these information, your step 4 is to add all of the expenses relative to the first quarter, which is your variable expense of 900,000, other fixed expenses of 660,000, your allocated advertising expense for Q1, which is 100,000, and your allocated depreciation expense for Q1, which is 260,000, for a total Q1 expense of 1,920,000. And let's proceed with problem number 4. Isla Company prepared the following income statement for the current year. Okay, so yearly po siya na income statement. Binigyan po tayo ng information na ganito. Third quarter sales is 30% of total sales. For interim reporting purposes, yan yung sinasabi ko sa inyo na pag interim reporting, gagamit tayo ng estimates. So, a gross profit rate of 40% can be justified. Variable operating expenses are allocated in the same proportion as sales. Sanay naman na tayo dyan. Siyempre, kung ano ang galaw ng sales, usually, ang variable cost, diba, ganun din ang galawan. So, ganun din i-apply natin dito. However, your fixed operating expenses are allocated based on passage of time, so incurred evenly throughout the year. Of the total operating expenses, so kita naman po natin na 500,000 siya. 400,000 is variable and 100,000 is fixed. Tapos na sa income statement natin, meron daw tayong gain on sale of equipment. Yung equipment daw po kasi ay binenta noong June 1 at meron daw po tayong loss on casualty na 300,000 dahil po sa casualty loss na nangyari noong September 1. Ang tanong po sa atin, income before tax related for the third quarter lamang. At ang third quarter po natin ay July, August, September. That's very important for you to know. Okay? So, yung third quarter po natin is July, August, September. And this is how you do it. Yung sales po natin for the whole for the whole year na 6 million, 30% daw po yung relative sa third quarter. So, you just have to multiply 6 million by 30% to get 1,800,000 sales attributable for the third quarter. For your cost of goods sold, since our gross profit rate is 40%, your cost of goods sold rate would just be 60%. So, your sales of 1,800,000, you multiply it by 60% and you get a cost of goods sold for third quarter of 1,080,000 and it will also give you a gross profit of 720,000. For your variable expenses, it's allocated in the same proportion as sales. So, if your sales is 30%, then your variable expenses will also be 30%. Okay? So, 400,000 times 30% is 120,000. Okay? And then, for fixed expenses, it's 100,000 divided by 4 kasi passage of time daw po. Sir, tanong, bakit yung buong 500,000 yung ginagamit mong operating expenses, pang quarter lang naman to? O, ganito yan. Sabi naman natin, 30% ng total sales mo ang pang third quarter. So, yung 400,000 mo, 30% na talaga yung pang third quarter niya. Okay? And then, for fixed expenses, you just have to divide it by 4 quarters, which is 25,000. Okay? Sir, ano na pong gagawin natin dun sa gain on sale of equipment? Ba't hindi na po natin makita dito sa solution? Kailan daw po ba nangyari yung selling na equipment? June 1. So, ang June 1 ay part po ng second quarter. At sabi po natin kanina, any gains or losses are not allocated in all of the time periods. Any gains or losses will only be reported in the interim reports on the quarter or the period it happened. So, hindi po siya kasama sa third quarter interim FS. Okay? But your loss of casualty which happened on September 1 is pasok po sa third quarter na pangyayari. So, yung buong loss on casualty na 300,000 is part of your loss for quarter 3. And again, ulitin natin, gains or losses are not allocated. It will only be reported in the interim period where it relates. Kaya po yung buong 300,000 talagang nandyan. Okay? So, just perform the calculations of your income statement and your quarter 3 income before tax is 275,000. And those are our problems for interim financial reporting. Let's use this given coming from the textbook of Professor Robles and Empleo, which is your try nating i-determine alin dito sa segment A, B, C, D, and E ang reportable segments. So, binigyan po tayo ng information about identifiable assets, internal and external revenues and their total, and the operating results as to profit or loss. This is the first thing that you need to do. Get first the total of your identifiable assets. So, 10 plus 4 plus 4 plus 20 plus 11, your total identifiable assets is 49 million. Get also the total of your external and internal revenues to get your total revenues, and then get it also 86 million. And then, as to profit, 8 plus 1 plus 11 is 20. 3 and 4 is 7. So, meron tayong profit na 20 million and loss na 7 million. Get at absolute value kung ano yung mas malaki. 20 versus 7, you get 20. Okay? So, ito po yung susundin natin, yung 20 million. Get now the 10% to serve as your determinants. So 49 million divided by 49 million times 10% is 4.9 million. 86 million multiplied by 10% is 8,600,000, and 20 million times 10% is 2 million. Isa-isahin natin ngayon yung iyong mga segments para makita natin kung reportable ba siya or not. And let's first try these identifiable asset. Ang gagamitin natin is asset test. Your determinant is 4,900,000. Segment A is 10 million. Mas malaki siya sa 4.9. Pasok, reportable. Segment B is only 4 million. It's not reportable. Segment C is also 4 million. It's not reportable. Segment D is 20 million, above 4.9 million, and it's reportable. And segment E, 11 million, it's also reportable. So as to the asset test, the segments that are reportable is segment A, D, and E. Let's now go to your revenue test. Okay? So ang determinant natin is at least dapat 8,600,000 siya. So segment A is reportable. Ang laki niyan, 30 million. Segment B is higher than 8.6 million, 10 million. That's also reportable. But C is not reportable kasi 7 million lang siya. For segment D, it's also reportable kasi 30 million siya, and for E is 26. Okay, so as to your revenue test, ang reportable segments mo is A, B, D, and E. Let's try the operating results test. Okay, so your determinant is 2 million at absolute value, 8 million is pasok, 3 million is pasok, 1 million is not pasok, 4 million is pasok, and 11 million is pasok. Okay, so ang sabi natin ay any of the following. Ibig sabihin, isa lang. So, potentially, segment A, pasok sa identifiable, sa asset test, sa revenue test, at sa operating result test. Si B, although hindi siya nakapasok sa asset test, pasok naman siya sa revenue and operating results test. Pasok pa din. Kasi isa lang naman required eh. Si C, walang na answer na 10%. So, hindi. Si D, all 3, and si E, all 3 din. Okay? Ngayon, is it safe to assume that segment A, B, D, and E is now reportable? Hindi pa. Magsa 75% testing tayo. Galing dito sa external revenues. Get the total of the external revenue and it will give you 66 million. Check mo ngayon yung mga potential reportable segments mo, which is A, B, D, and E, and get the total of all of them. The total of the external revenues of A, B, D, and E is 60 million. Now, what you need to do is to determine kung pasok siya dun sa 75% ruling natin. 60 million divided by 66 million is 91%. Dahil pasok po siya dun sa 75%, we can therefore conclude that reportable segments ang A, B, D, and E. Sir, paano po kung ipag-a-add yung A, B, D, and E external revenues, dinivide dun sa 66 million, hindi naka 75%. Ang gagawin natin, isasama na natin si segment C para maging 75% na siya. So, ang mangyayari, si segment C magiging reportable na din po. Ganun lang. Okay? And that has been our discussion for interim financial reporting and reporting on operating segments. And our next lesson is accounting for correction of errors. Again, please like, share, and subscribe to Sir Chua's Accounting Lessons PH and hit the notification bell button. Comment down your questions, suggestions, and reactions. This has been Sir Chua's Accounting Lessons PH. To God be all the glory, honor, and praise. Thank you and have a great day. Sarangeo.